Hello and welcome to a conversation with the Middle East Monitor. This week we are turning our attention to a new book, Islam and the Arab Revolutions, the ulama between democracy and autocracy.
I have my own copy as well.
So this is the latest book on the Arab uprising of 2011. This volume dives deep into, I would say, somewhat uncharted dimensions of the Arab Revolution, namely the response of prominent religious scholars to the events that unfolded between, in particular, 2011 and 2013. I have the pleasure of having with me the author of the book, Dr. Usaama al-Azami. He's a lecturer at the University of Oxford in Contemporary Islamic Studies. Welcome to a conversation with MEMO, Usaama, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Nassim, for having me. It's really a pleasure to be able to talk about a book I've written over many years. So finally it's here, and it's really a pleasure to be able to discuss it with you.
It's great. I mean, I've been following your work for a number of years, and this is quite an impressive book. So congratulations, first of all, for producing this work. As I say, it's an impressive book and a fascinating read. But I want to kind of begin our conversation with a question, not so much about the book itself, but where it sits within Arab and Middle Eastern political landscape, and answer a question that may come to the minds of many MEMO readers and others who don't follow, because this is a very specific discussion within Muslim communities.
Right.
Can Muslim scholars be considered genuine political actors, within the context of a vast revolutions, spanning a number of countries, to warrant this kind of attention you are giving and we are giving in this discussion? I mean, are they genuine political actors we should be considering in this day and age?
Right. Thank you. Thanks once again for having me, and thank you for your generous remarks about my book. I mean, you describe it as impressive. It's also kind of a challenging read, especially given the subject matter devolves quite, quickly, I think, towards the latter half of the text to rather dark considerations, as it were. Mm. So with respect to your question as to whether, the ulama can be considered political actors, I think it's an interesting question because it kind of reflects the times that we live in. So we live in a time where the dominant sort of political ideology of governance is a secular ideology. It's informed by a shift away from sort of a religion as it's understood, constituted, whether it's in Europe by Christianity, whether it's in the Muslim world by Islam. And I mean, one of the subtle points that I'm making, which you've picked up on by writing about the ulama, is I'm basically saying they're actually still important. And this is an argument that, scholars in the academy have been making for a while, actually. They've been there's been a reconsideration of the role of the ulama in the public square over the last, 20 or 30 years, that has come to recognize actually they form an interesting and important lobby group of sorts, but they also have, according to some scholars, certain sort of special interests which they might sort of participate in the public square to be able to preserve. Historically, they've had a far greater role. The ulama basically were all the educated classes. So anyone who was educated would have gone through a theological training or a juristic training, and they would have made up the civil servants of a state in the pre-modern Muslim world. And so that level of influence has certainly diminished in the modern period, but it hasn't disappeared. In fact, in Muslim majority countries, I would argue, there is a significant sort of sector of the community, of the populace, who would take these people very seriously, including in their political pronouncements.
I mean, you mentioned some of the darker considerations at the end of your book, and that was very interesting to read. And we will return to that, and also some of the points you touched on now. We'll kind of do 360 degrees, return to the gist of what I'm trying to get to at the end of this conversation. But I think the subheading of your book kind of gives you a flavor of what it's about, which is namely the division between many of the mainstream Sunni scholars over how they positioned themselves within the Arab Spring. But before we discuss the arguments they advance in justifying their support for democracy, popular uprising, or their support for autocracy, just introduce for us, the main characters in the book and their respective position.
Sure. I mean, just to append a comment to the last question as well, and I make this point in my introduction, I'm also trained as an alim, meaning I'm trained as one of these,
I should have said that at the beginning. I should have said that. Yes.
And consequently, there is a kind of perhaps a self, I hope not self-aggrandizing, but there's a self-legitimating component to this maybe. But with respect to your question about the sort of significance of the, sorry, forgive me, I've kind of digressed to the point of forgetting your question, but it's about who the main players
are and their respective positions regarding whether they supported autocracy or democracy, just so that we have a baseline framework to work with as we move forward with our conversation.
So with respect to, so who are the main players in this book? In a sense, my book goes chronologically from 2011 to 2013 in the main and then beyond. But each chapter is dedicated to one or a series of scholars. And so two of them are on the cover of the book. Yusuf al-Qaradawi in the center, Ali Goma on the left. And this chap is a political figure, of course, perhaps one of the most important political figures in the region. Now, Yusuf al-Qaradawi is an Egyptian sort of graduate of the Azhar. He's a very elderly scholar now in his mid-90s. And he is one of the Azhar's most sort of globally recognized graduates, but also a member of the Muslim Brotherhood and someone who spent time with the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna. Ali Goma, and he's in a sense the most pro-democracy figure that I look at in the text. But there are other scholars who, in a sense, fall on that side, who I look at in a little less detail than I look at the thought of Yusuf al-Qaradawi in the later chapters. People like Muhammad Imara, now passed, Hassan al-Shafi'i. A lot of these people I wrote about were very important figures in 2011, 2012, and 2013, but some of them have passed away. Hassan al-Shafi'i, an advisor to the Sheikh al-Azhar, the sort of the grand imam of the Azhar. And I've mentioned the Azhar a few times now. The Azhar, of course, is, many of your listeners will know, the sort of seen as one of the most important centers for Sunni learning in the Muslim world. Consequently, the person who is the rector of the Azhar, the Sheikh al-Azhar, as it were, has a very high-ranking position by virtue of the sort of the importance of al-Azhar. It's not really hierarchical in the sense that the Pope is actually instituted as part of the head of the church. It's basically by virtue of the institution's significance through history. So the Sheikh al-Azhar and the other chap I mentioned here, Ali Goma, I mean, he's kind of the main villain, so to speak, of the book. And I dedicate a couple of chapters looking at the way in which he sort of justified, mass murder, really. But the Sheikh al-Azhar is the other person who is, in a sense, pro-autocratic, even though he's not someone who, in my estimation, looked with pleasure upon the mass murder that was precipitated by
the Ahmed Tayyib you're speaking about.
Ahmed al-Tayyib. So the Sheikh al-Azhar is someone called Ahmed al-Tayyib. He figures sort of in a couple of chapters, and he is extremely important as a figure. But I spend more time on Ali Goma because I think he's a far more interesting figure and far more beloved to the coup regime of Egypt that is currently sort of in power.
And I mean, you did mention, I mean, there's one head political figure, which is bin Zayed, who is the crown prince of the UAE. Right. People who aren't familiar with this subject will think, UAE is a small country, why isn't the crown prince Mohammed bin Salman one of the guys up there, or Erdogan, who is, president of Turkey. So what's his role in this in this battle?
Yes, MBZ is, and I think in a sense, it's a very accurate headline in the New York Times from 2 years ago in 2019, I think August, that one of their journalists wrote a piece called "The Most Powerful Man." I think it was David Kirkpatrick, actually. The most powerful man in the Middle East is not MBS, it's MBZ. So everyone knows about MBS because of Khashoggi, and he is the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. Perhaps not as entrenched as someone like MBZ, who is decades older than MBS. And is the crown prince and de facto ruler of the United Arab Emirates. But MBZ, I think it's true, is the most powerful monarch in the Middle East, and the person who has, really successfully orchestrated a counter-revolutionary wave, which has, brought to an end the experiment that started in 2011. I like to say that they haven't really brought it to an end, because the ideas that were unleashed in 2011 have staying power, but has really managed to suppress, whether it's in Sudan, whether it's in Libya, and now has, managed to, in my estimation, bring to heel Erdogan as well. So Erdogan was one of these people who was quite vocal in support of the Arab revolutions, but is now essentially has received MBZ at the White Palace, as it were, in the last week or so, and is in need of UAE investment as he tanks his economy through his very unusual and kind of irrational monetary policy, shall we say.
Yeah, that's a huge subject in itself, I think.
Yes,
we'll
indeed.
probably have a conversation about that, how things have gone full cycle in the Middle East.
One other thing to mention about MBZ is he is also, of course, linked to a couple of other scholars that I haven't mentioned yet, Hamza Yusuf and Abdullah bin Bayya. And so perhaps we can discuss them.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I read the book, and you do. I mean, Ali Roma does take up a lot of the pages, and yes, for Europeans and Westerners, I think Abdullah bin Bayya and Hamza Yusuf is more interesting to discuss, because of their justification for a form of government which would be seen as quite alien in this modern day and age. Supporting. We'll get to that question later on, but I want to, before we get to that question, I want to ask why you haven't included, say, a Shi'i scholar in their position towards the Arab Spring.
Right. And a very, very important question, of course. I mean, it's really an accident of where these revolutions take place. So these are really taking place in the Arab world, meaning Arab-speaking countries. And the major Shia sort of states are, Iran is the major Shia state, as it were. Iraq is a very mixed state, but has a majority Shia population. And Iran didn't witness a revolution of this kind in 2011. And so, in a sense, the Shia scholars didn't really play the prominent role that, just in passing, I mentioned that Ahmed al-Tayyib does seem to make disparaging comments towards Hassan Nasrallah, or I think it was the actual supreme leader of Iran. But those figures don't really have a very prominent voice, I think, in a lot of this. Hassan Nasrallah is very important in the Syrian revolution. For better or for worse, I mean, I couldn't really incorporate the Syrian revolution in this book. It's already almost 400 pages. And this book is primarily on Egypt. The Syrian revolution does have sort of good writing on it, but the ulama still are largely neglected, except in the work of Thomas Piret. Thomas Piret, who's a scholar in France, who's written a book on the ulama of Syria. But he has one chapter on the Syrian revolution. I think that work still remains to be done, and perhaps I can try to address in future work of mine.
Yeah, I think it would have been quite tasking to put the entire Arab Spring within one volume, in one single narrative, all the different countries. Very difficult, and the details you've gone into, and which I urge everyone to read, is very, very interesting. One thing a lot of, including Muslims, would be quite baffled by is the extent to which someone like Ali Goma gave backing to the massacre in, Rabaa massacre in Egypt in 2013. I mean, we know Muslims generally, scholars differ on so many aspects of our religion, fiqh issues, but is this unusual in Islamic history where you have one scholar who is fully backing to the tilt a regime that's almost hounding its opposition?
Right.
Is this unusual in Islamic history?
So, I mean, to say something is unusual in Islamic history requires a knowledge of Islamic history, which I can't claim. But I mean, like to say that through Islamic history, no one's ever done anything like this is probably untrue, meaning it's always probably always been possible to find a scholar to rubber stamp an opinion that, you know, a ruler wants to justify. What's troubling about a figure like Ali Goma is that he is a very prominent scholar. Consequently, I mean, for me, what it does seem incredibly striking that a scholar will, of his standing, someone who is recognized as a jurist of, you know, very high standing, can stoop to the level of basically weaponizing his knowledge. So my interpretation of Ali Goma is that, you know, in a nutshell, is he is willing to use his intellectual resources to justify anything that the state asks him to justify. And that at that point, you're no longer really sort of functioning as a scholar, you're functioning as a mercenary. And to a certain extent, this is also true for someone like Abdullah bin Bayya. But Abdullah bin Bayya is someone who is, you know, some steps removed from the actual bloodshed, whereas Ali Goma, as I talk about in the later chapters of the book, actually celebrates the bloodshed and is in the company of all the people, whether it's General Sisi or the Minister of Interior. And this is why I actually refer to my sort of chapter 7, I call it Ali Goma celebrating the Rabaa massacre, because I actually see that that's what he's doing. That's, you know, not the level that someone like Abdullah bin Bayya would stoop to. But yeah, so in that regard, I think it's quite exceptional. And it's exceptional and it's possibly not exceptional in the sense that he did this in private. We live in an age where, you know, people can, you know, have recordings of these things and distribute it. And we don't know what sort of conversations took place in private very often in our history. Yeah, so hope that makes sense.
I mean, yeah, it does. I mean, in the latter chapters in your book, you do say that the ulama sultan, the scholars who use their knowledge in the service of power, many of the, I mean, to quote you, many of the previous pre-modern scholars would have been shocked by their pre-modern forebearers to the positions they took during the Rabaa massacre.
Right.
So in what way would the pre-modern scholars have been shocked by the position taken by Saleh?
So that comment, which is in chapter 9, is actually a comment about not really about the Rabaa massacre. I'm just arguing that the way in which Sunni quietism is presented by some as legitimating things like the sort of Egyptian coup or the unstinting support that someone like Abdullah bin Bayya has offered the United Arab Emirates, I think that would be, you know, shocking to the sensibilities of the scholars who are sometimes invoked to justify that kind of quietism. So I'm thinking about sort of, and I have a short article on a sort of a Muslim commentary website called Muslim Matters, where I critique a sort of a position articulated by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, one of the other figures who features in a couple of my chapters, who argues that actually when it comes to rulers and political authorities, Muslims must always show sort of unquestioning obedience, virtually. And this is something which you don't actually find in the classical tradition. Obedience is always conditioned on that sort of being in line with legal norms, for example. And the legal norms we're talking about, the rule of law system that existed in the pre-modern era was a Sharia-based legal system. And so, you know, that's what I think would be shocking. When people invoke people like al-Ghazali as this sort of, al-Ghazali dies in the year 1111, one of the most important theologians and jurists of his era, and very influential down the centuries as well, and someone who is greatly admired by a number of the scholars that I've mentioned. But he's sometimes invoked as saying that, well, you know, the Sunni tradition says we have to accept whatever the rulers do. But that's not actually what his doctrine is at all. He speaks about, and I sort of give evidence of this, he speaks about sort of criticizing the rulers vocally. In fact, he has a certain radical position where he says that you can develop vigilante bands to try and go and correct mistakes that are made, even though those vigilante bands shouldn't rebel against the ruler. They can sort of go around as sort of vigilante police forces in communities to make sure everyone's observing the Sharia correctly. So, some modern scholars have basically described Ghazali as flirting with radicalism in that particular instance. So someone like him to be invoked to justify basically mass murder, or at least absolute quiescence, it just doesn't make any sense. He's someone who explicitly talks about and in a sense celebrates in his work the idea of people standing up to the ruler and telling them, know your place. You cannot, go against God's norms and things like this. So, the notion that they can perpetrate mass murder and the sort of scholars will remain silent, or in the case of someone like Guma, actively support it, is completely sort of a myth, which is being created, in my view, to legitimate sort of modern autocracy. There's a kind of effort in the modern period on the part of scholars like these to manufacture a myth of quietism that doesn't really exist in the Islamic scholarly tradition. So
if we can focus on that, I think you spend a lot of time making the case for open society and democracy in your book, and you debunk the myth of Sunni quietism. If you can explain that, and also generally, I think the scholars you cite in your book, they fall either within the camp of those who advocate for the divine rights of kings. Hamza Yusuf, you mentioned, has his own way of arriving at that justification using religious texts and Islamic history. And then you have someone like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who's really advocating for government by consent. And you think that's something, should be natural and welcome in this day and age, government by consent. These are the two polars. Well, not in the Middle East, but at least in the West, in the way they support regimes, who they choose to support in the Middle East. They always seem to be advocating for those who are justifying divine rights of kings, people like Hamza Yusuf and the other scholars who are given a platform in the West and also in various Washington institutions, whereas those who are advocating for government by consent are never always on the, labeled as terrorists and extremists. So I want to just kind of tease that out a bit more.
Sure.
Why Sunnism isn't really quietist as many people believe. And there is.
So, there are two questions there, and let me just briefly touch on the fact that, the question about the West's behavior towards sort of its own norms when it clashes with its interests in sort of geopolitics. That's a longer discussion and a challenging one in practice, because the West has, of course, historically colonized that region. And colonization is about sort of going and plundering resources and so on. And that's, in a sense, continued in other sort of forms, colonization by other means in the post-colonial era. And so the West's behavior as a sort of geopolitical bloc, whether it's the United States, the EU, or all of them together, in the region is very far from its claimed norms, the ostensible norms that they claim to uphold. And this is something that we, as sort of citizens in the West, although Muslim citizens in the West are on some level potentially second-class citizens as well, because they do not sort of adhere to certain types of understandings of how it's a longer discussion, but the war on terror basically places you under suspicion if you have a certain sounding name, and so we are, in a sense, part of that underclass, and we are an extension potentially of the post-colony, so to speak. And so there is this kind of schizophrenia between the values and interests that is sometimes spoken of in Western contexts, and it's something which Western citizens, Muslim and non-Muslim, need to have dialogue about in a very serious way. With respect to the question of quietism specifically, so I talk about this in chapter 9, and I'm not original in this. I'm drawing. I have this massive quote from Khalid Abul Fadl, a professor at UCLA and a Muslim jurist of very serious sort of scholarly regard, shall we say. And he, in his book from 2001, I want to say, A Rebellion and Violence in Islamic Law, published by Cambridge University Press, early on in the introduction, he points out that actually, what on earth is this doctrine of quietism that everyone speaks of? Because quietism itself is not a terribly coherent doctrine. If you think about what it implies is that a quietist scholar will approve a usurper coming and taking power. So the scenario is you have a ruler and someone comes and dethrones that ruler and takes over. And so the doctrine which is upheld or described as quietism is the acceptance of this new ruler who has unseated the previous ruler as being Sunni orthodoxy. Now, there's a good reason for that in the medieval era, and I can go into that, but to call this quietism, to call the legitimation of a usurper quietism, is a bit of an absurdity because the person's just unseated someone through an act of rebellion. In a sense, the opposite of that would be to say that actually the first person is just and we're going to resist the person who's come into power. Okay, that might be described as a kind of activist opposition to rebels, but to justify someone actually being able to overthrow a ruler doesn't seem to make sense.
Well, that scenario played out in the case of Egypt, clearly, didn't it?
Right. So it played out twice, of course. In the first instance, it played out at the hands of the populace, and in the second instance, it played out at the hands of the military. On some level, the military acquiesced in the first instance, and that's why it was possible in a sense. But in 2011, that act of rebellion on the part of the populace, which was not undertaken by anyone with sort of heavy artillery or anything like that. It was done by people protesting occasionally in a violent manner on the streets, but largely, unarmed civilians. That was considered to be an act of rebellion on the part of Ali Qum'a and Ahmed al-Tayyib, which was illegitimate. But when the military did it, it was considered legitimate. And this is the other dimension of the sort of quietism doctrine, which is sometimes invoked. And this might be part of the reason why they're justifying it, but I still think it's unjustified. They're saying, well, the people who rebel have to have power, enough power to be able to really take control. And, if they manage to unseat the previous ruler and they really take control, then the scholars will legitimate them. They will sort of ultimately affirm that actually we can sort of recognize these people as rulers. Now, the problem that we have with the situation of the quietism doctrine in the Sunni tradition is that it was, in a sense, a reactionary doctrine, in a sense. So in the sense that the scholars would observe this taking place in the political realm, but they wouldn't actively participate on any side. And that was what was described as quietism. What you have with people like Qum'a, what you have with people like Abdullah bin Bayya is they're working for these states that are fomenting, or these militaries that are fomenting coups. So that is hardly quietist either. And then finally, there's this other point about sort of what quietism means in the context of, I've actually, I've missed, I've forgotten, I was going to make another point, but it's kind of slipped my mind at this point.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't matter, but because we are kind of running out of time, and I want to speak about some of the more broader considerations and
Sure.
some of the darker aspects of the ramifications of the positions and the doctrines taken by pro-regime, pro-authoritarian scholars, which is the rise of Daesh and ISIS, if you want to call them, and also creates an Islamic almost justification for Islamophobia within Europe. So that's the end result. The rise of Daesh. You focus on that. You mentioned how there's a correlation between, the rise of Daesh and the suffocation of pro-democracy activism within in Egypt, and also what Muslims are facing in Europe in general, the rise of Islamophobia, how there is a link to that. I'm going to speak to that a bit.
Sure, and I mean, I really wanted to elaborate further on this, but it's a bit of a long book, so I kind of held my tongue. But one point I make, and I'm not the only person making this, a number of scholars and other sort of commentators have made this, is that ISIS could not have really come about without the failure of the democratic project in the Middle East. And so the people who are orchestrating that failure, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, so King Abdullah is quite significant as well, Israel, that sort of, and the Egyptian military, these people are really, in a sense, co-creators of ISIS, but also they need something like ISIS to be able to legitimate their own existence, to really sort of justify why they exist, to the West in particular. So the United Arab Emirates, and I've written about this briefly elsewhere, but I haven't published, unfortunately, is one of the major engines for Islamophobia in Europe and North America. There's quite a bit of evidence that they've actively funded organizations that are Islamophobic, that foment this fear of Muslim civil society. And there's a very good reason for it, of course, because they don't want Muslim civil society to be a vibrant sort of phenomenon in their countries. Otherwise, it threatens their rule. And so, it's really astounding when people like a figure I mentioned in passing, he's the current Grand Mufti of Egypt and has signed off on various death warrants on the part of these military tribunals, hundreds of people being sentenced to death. But Shawqi Allam, he has a sort of like a video which went viral like a year and a half ago, I think, where he was saying, half of the Muslims in Europe are members of ISIS or something, just ridiculous like this, right? And so, this kind of somewhat insane narrative, which is promoted actively by these sorts of groups, these sorts of regimes, basically, does feed into a pan-European and pan-Western sort of narrative about the threat of Muslims. And it fits into this global war on terror narrative as well, of course, unfortunately.
There's lots for us to discuss. Unfortunately, this time just flown by, and we are at the end of our time. 40 minutes is quite long, and I want to thank you. I want to recommend everyone to get the book, Islam and the Arab Revolutions. Did you want to add anything? Before we conclude, did you want to say anything more that you hoping to say?
Actually, one thing to maybe mention is that right now there's a Black Friday deal with Hurst Publishers. So if anyone wants to get the book with half price off, unfortunately, academic books are expensive, so you can hopefully get 50% off. But otherwise, I hope that this starts a conversation about sort of the role of religion and the role of religious scholarship, the ulama, in the public sphere, because I think they have a role to play. But unfortunately, in many instances, they've basically just been weaponized by the most pernicious elements in places like the Middle East to justify repression on a scale which is really unfathomable, and contributes to the sort of problems that we see on the global stage as well. So I think that's something that we need to think about, and we need to develop, and I hope to sort of write more about this, but develop a democratic discourse that is indigenously owned by Muslims, an Islamic democratic or a Muslim democratic discourse that will, that's probably the most important thing that we can do in the absence of actually having power in the region and civil society activists. And we should do what we can to support the civil society activists in the region to be able to realize more accountable government and more free societies. I hope that is something that I've contributed to in a small way.
I'm sure you have, and thank you for your encouraging recommendations in the end. Really enjoyed that conversation. I urge everyone to read it. I want to thank Usaama for joining us and all those who tuned in at home. See you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for having me.